The Sega Dream. The dream of greater success following the Saturn at the heels of monolith Sony and Nintendo, of a brilliant device built to usher in the new millennium. As we all know, the dream was too big, as this console marks the death of Sega as a hardware company. In the home market anyways. Sega excelled in the arcade ecosystem, pumping out dozens of machine boards and multitudes more unique games well before and after the death of their at-home consoles. With classics such as Outrun, House of the Dead, and Spike Out, Sega wanted to bring their heritage to the household through the Dreamcast and its sister Naomi arcade board, introducing a console with genuine arcade-accurate fidelity and hardware to an extent. This made arcade conversions to the console simple, most notably in the case of Virtual-On or Oratorio Tangram, possibly the most defining cyber fighter on the system and arcades alike. Fighting games were at home on the Dreamcast, but the nicher subset of mecha brawlers was quite an untapped genre. With the success of Armored Core, Fromsoftware no doubt wanted to bring a similar experience to Sega's hot new platform. However, it's possible there was a publishing agreement with Sony, as they were responsible for distributing the original game in the West, and the Armored Core franchise did not leave the PlayStation until the release of Armored Core 4 in 2006. It's also equally possible that FromSoftware simply wanted the freedom that a disconnect from Armored Core brought. Developing a title of smaller scale, with less expectations behind it, would outweigh the risk from an unknown step into Sega's rocky platform. Thus, Frame Gride was born, and its separation from the high-tech dystopia of Armored Core made way for an entirely unique aesthetic, and many odd new gameplay mechanics. Right away, you'll notice that Frame Gride is a vastly different flavor of mecha than Armored Core. Whereas AC was all about resource management and fast-paced mobility mixed with weapon variety and gunplay that pushes players to their limits, Frame Gride is notably more simple and clunky. Though that's not to say it's without speed. It is, however, largely lacking in precision and thus a necessity for mastery in combat. Resource conservation is slim, only balancing health and a regenerating energy bar that delivers no penalties for overexerting it. Gameplay clunkiness is partially brought on by the Dreamcast's simple controller layout, with a single D-pad plus analog stick on the same side of the controller, and a lack of bumpers above the triggers, creating a weird situation where most games will practically ignore the D-pad, or even more bizarrely, the analog stick, despite its wider range of motion. In the case of Frame Gride, the D-pad movement is identical to Kingsfield or Armored Core, utilizing the triggers to turn and an absence of vertical looking. You can still technically look around with the analog stick, but it's still relative to your angle and quite limited in usefulness. This is completely unnecessary for beating the game, as it doesn't increase your firing angle, and the awkward contortions required for your hand to maneuver and look simultaneously would only hinder your movement capabilities. Frame Gride isn't complex or demanding enough to necessitate constant sights on your opponent anyways, so get comfortable allowing the generous auto-aim or situational awareness to take over. Boosting is now binary, removing a large chunk of potential with the movement system. Lightly tapping A grants a small boost upward, while holding initiates a longer jump, but will invariably force the player back to ground, preventing any sort of mid-air boosting. This mechanic has been degraded down to a glorified jump and no longer consumes energy and can be held indefinitely while on land, granting no penalty, but no benefit other than moving slightly faster. No more erratic air maneuvers or jump boost tech here. This unfortunately reduces battles to being rather straightforward with little skill expression, practically gutting the resource management angle and turning fights into a direct confrontation with only minor use of traps or situational corners within the environment. Thankfully, to outweigh the lack of depth and movement comes a completely new melee fighting system. Close quarters combat has more variety through combos and punches than AC's singular sword swing option, transforming it into a proper fighting style rather than a defense mechanism. Your frame has has the choice of 8 different melee weapons with their own speed and arc, plus the ever-present opportunity to punch straight into your opponent. On their own, the swords feel rather stiff, but upon holding both triggers while pressing B, your frame will strike a triple combo, dealing far more damage in a fluid motion than with awkwardly swinging 3 times separately. This translates to the punch as well, through the Y button, same as firing your gun, only when close enough to an enemy does it change into a punch. There's even a shield that blocks projectiles on top of the given melee weapons, able to halt a single sword combo or even the ability to parry if timed right, giving an instant counter opportunity. Trying to initiate a sword combo while far away from the enemy will result in a sword magic attack instead, which varies upon your element. L plus R plus Y does a similar special magic attack through your gun instead, which can result in a floating bomb or landmine for your opponents. Holding Y plus B triggers your back weapon, which all have different effects, and are some of the most unique and powerful projectiles. Pressing LR and X typically triggers a defensive spell, although I rarely remembered or used this combo during the game. Finally, holding L plus R plus X plus Y plus B consumes all of your frame's energy and transfers it into a massive explosion that'll cancel your opponent's current actions, damaging and stunning them briefly, while also damaging you, effectively granting a window to escape from dire situations. There is one combo outside of direct combat usefulness. X plus A summons a little helper drone by the name of a squire. There are 32 different squires that can be crafted throughout the game and will be discussed more during the frame building segment. It's a lot to memorize, but these combos give a far wider range of options at any given moment, as opposed to Armored Core's deep and narrower system, where the Raven only has the opportunity to fire their weapon or swipe at the opponent up close, which it made up for through its vast amount of weapons and the pivotal role that movement and resource management plays, making combat still incredibly engaging despite technically few offensive options. Frame Gride, on the other hand, flips the dynamic, offering more attack methods to counteract the lack of movement mechanics. Personally, this makes Frame Gride less intense of a game. While still fun, it would be far less exciting to play with real players since all of these attack options don't have any other system to interact with. There is no evolution past the basic and combo attacks. You can't chain moves together fluently or only do a double combo. Every attack is rigid and isolated from the last. The base combat options are also rather unsatisfying. Guns are incredibly inaccurate, deal negligible damage generally, and have pitiful range to add insult onto the already poor projectile tracking that makes it incredibly difficult to hit any moving target. To an extent, this makes sense, given it's an infinite armed cannon that would make encounters easy if it were too powerful, but the only marginally good guns take up way too much energy and would prevent you from being able to use better attacks if relied upon. So while it is still an option, the player is far better off conserving their energy for actually effective special attacks. As a result, guns end up not contributing to combat depth in a meaningful way. Now, I could still be too narrowly sighted to see the use of ranged weapons, but throughout the whole campaign I tried maximizing damage and tested each gun, but still found the majority of them to be uncompelling, only a few with decently powerful projectiles that were hindered by short range and succumbed to the problem of, well, I'm already this close to the mech, I might as well use my sword instead. I'm not going to say that guns are completely useless, but they didn't feel enjoyable to use for the large part of my over 100 battles in Frame Gride. At least melee weapons were made a viable alternative to ranged and not just supplementary. All of the back weapons are an interesting addition to an encounter, but also consume too much energy to be constantly relied upon, so swords pick up the weight of standard attacks and offer a simple but effective main option. Sure, your weapon only has the single swing or triple combo, but at least its base attack doesn't consume any energy and is far more efficient than a rifle. With greater damage, you're also more likely to degrade a particular piece of your enemy's frame. It's not a mechanic that pops up frequently during play, as parts typically need to take a lot of focused damage to be destroyed, but it'll likely happen to a frame's legs through repeated mortar barrages. Parts in the red are ineffective and will hinder a certain mechanic. Broken legs result in not being able to boost or jump, and while no other part is broken during my gameplay, it's safe to assume a broken shield can't block. A damaged head would hinder lock-on. A broken right arm could make the sword unusable. The core, being the most open-ended part, likely drastically worsening energy regeneration. When a part is battered even beyond the red state, it becomes completely destroyed and is no longer usable, forcing the player to craft a new piece or replace it with a different variant. That's right, Cryvale's crafting class is back in session. This will be on the test. I won't be discussing how to create every single item, however, because the fusion system is much more simple and straightforward than what I had to cover in Eternal Ring, which makes sense given Frame Gride released a year prior. There are 3 different frame archetypes that each have their own separate lists of legs, core, arms, and head pieces. The player begins with a fully built medium frame and will have to spend a lot of gems for the early game if they want to switch to a light or heavy build. Creating these parts is very streamlined though, as each lists the pair of gems required to build them, occasionally having 2 separate combinations for the same part, seemingly to prevent the player from getting stuck not being able to collect enough rare gems. Of course, the developers didn't extend this to the melee weapon that requires 2 of the same rarest crystal in the game that don't drop for literal hours of gameplay, but at least some of these alternative fusions are helpful. There are 13 gem types that have the possibility of dropping after winning a battle or from destroying enemy squires. Battle drops are seemingly random within a set pool, differing between each opponent, but generally, even though there are uncommon or somewhat rare crystals, you'll acquire a fair amount of each without having to specifically go for them. Squires only drop 1 out of the 2 material used to make them, giving both a refund when yours is destroyed and allowing the player to hunt specific gems more easily. There is a problem, however, as only 12 of the 13 crystals are utilized in squire creation. This leaves a single gem being unreliable to farm, and it just so happens to be exceedingly rarer than any others, evading my grasp for hours of gameplay and throughout the entire campaign while having heaps of every other gem. This yellow prismatic fuck single-handedly turns Frame Gride into Frame Grind, with easily at least an hour straight of constant refighting of the same opponent for just a single drop. But that's not enough. You need 4 of these things if you want to craft every weapon in the game, and even more for the few extra parts that require it in their only recipe. I'm not exaggerating here, it took me 81 battles on my save for just the first gem to drop. Granted, not all of those were from the few nights that actually dropped the item, but given the main story only consists of 10 battles, having to do nearly 8 times that for a single gem is absurd. If that isn't enough, here's my hour-and-a-half long recording of the roughly 30 battles it took to get another one that I tried finishing as quickly as possible. Granted, it would have taken far less time if the game didn't take 40 seconds to load. Some may say buying a Dreamcast exclusively for the only Fromsoft game to release on the console isn't a worthwhile investment, but this is authenticity. This is not something you'd get from emulation. This is Frame Gride, baby. It's still loading. The rare gem requirement for a couple weapons isn't too bad, since armor pieces and squires will be the bulk of what you craft in Frame Gride anyways. Weapons aren't breakable, and thus only need to be created once. Not to mention, body parts are the largest category if combining the 3 frame types. These generally affect the movement and melee fighting style of your mech, heavy being slow and tanky, while light is the fastest, but not particularly more flexible. I wouldn't say movement speed matters that much in Frame Gride, as opposed to raw health or defense. Sure, you can fly around the arena with the lackluster boosting mechanic, but still be susceptible to damage on your landing arc. Plus, with the poor aiming system, being unhittable also makes your opponent much the same. With the factor of unpredictability in fights, having higher health and defense will allow you to recover from bad situations easier. This doesn't require the player to sacrifice much movement speed either, as the scale from slow to fast isn't very vast. A heavy frame feels a little sluggish, and a light build does feel quite fun to zip around in, but the detriment of low speed is rarely felt, especially on a medium core that easily grants the best from all classes. Each body segment of a frame has 5 different parts to choose from, with significant enough stat differences to further personalize your build, be that high energy capacity and recharge rate, high endurance with slowly regenerating HP, or a well-rounded mech that can take as many punches as it deals. Every part shares the stats of FP, your frame's max health, defense points, and operation limit, which determines how much punishment that particular part can take before it breaks. Some stats are self-explanatory, others like the core's N-Re R stands for energy regeneration. Weapons have different stats but follow a similar naming pattern. The cannon has attack, range, blast speed, regeneration/reload speed, and energy efficiency. A sword has distance, i.e. magic, attack, and range above its normal or nearby attack and speed. While there aren't as many parts in Frame Gride than an armored core, there are still enough to make a distinct build, and with this game's smaller scope and focus on brief one-on-one battles, the lesser amount of choice doesn't feel as apparent. The final piece of frame building resides at the back of the mech, with 4 slots for extra discs, one primarily for squire bonuses, 2 spaces for general stat increase, and the final slot that attunes your frame to one of 4 elements. This introduces a new level of counterplay in the elemental affinity system, where one type is both stronger and weaker to another. It doesn't make complete logical sense, as fire is effective against wind but not weak against water. Fire is overall the best element, since earth is more defense-based, its damage against fire isn't as severe versus other elemental matchups, and the extra damage granted by the fire affinity somewhat outweighs the damage resistance against earth in turn. Having little weaknesses and a slight buff is generally more useful when going against a random opponent, and will help against starting a fight disadvantaged. This addition to mech building encapsulates Frame Gride's combat being more focused on raw statistics and countering your opponent than Armored Core's emphasis on skill. There can be an angle of counterplay in Armored Core through designing a mech to stunlock or outmaneuver your opponent, but there isn't so much as a blanket of an elemental weakness system overlaying the entire game that tips the scale of balance before the match even begins. I'm not saying this is a bad system necessarily, as it doesn't drastically affect combat, but competitively speaking, this isn't very good when not being able to swap elements mid-battle, like in more effective implementations of this same system. Instead, it feels cheap when playing a wind frame and getting shredded apart by a fire frame simply because you started on the wrong elements, and this mixes poorly with the inaccurate and janky attacks that already make combat feel luck-driven on their own. Squires are an optional aspect of your loadout. There are 32 total, ranging widely in power, survivability, and fighting style. Just because 2 squires look alike in appearance doesn't necessarily mean they have the same method of attack, since elemental type also influences their style. In theory, being able to summon autonomous help mid-battle is a unique and interesting mechanic that should add more depth to combat, which it somewhat does by introducing another target to track and divide attention between. But in practice, squires are really a glorified obstacle for both players on the board, regardless of who summoned them. See, Fromsoftware decided to be funny and give these little robots friendly fire, meaning whenever they blow up the enemy frame you're frequently right next to, well buddy, I hope you enjoy that skybox and getting interrupted in the middle of your combo. This is largely the reason I rarely used squires at battles, because I would often be interrupted by my own companion, which even cost me a few matches. Either the squires were too weak to impact the match or survive long enough, or had me watching my back hoping and praying these little fuckers don't fire at the most inopportune times and force my combat momentum to a screeching halt. Squires aren't all bad, a good half of them won't consistently interrupt combat, and it's an interesting experiment that certainly defines Frame Gride apart from Armored Core, Virtual On, or other mech games of its time, but again, this is terrible for an aspiring competitive game. Frame Gride was designed almost solely for player versus player combat. Nearly all of the fun and replayability you'll have is from fighting friends or randoms, and yet the developers decided to add slapstick comedy via precariously placed rakes and slipping on your own banana peels. It's funny, but goddamn, almost nothing in this game is designed cohesively or built with any synergy or regards to other mechanics. Jumping makes it harder to shoot your opponent and blocks your back weapon from being used. Punching or swinging your sword prevents energy recharge, and thus in order to do any special moves, you have to dash around the arena like a jackass without doing anything. You can very easily destroy your own squires. There's a magnetic death portal you can spawn from a specific back weapon, and your squire can easily be sucked in, wasting your special attack, the energy used to summon it, and likely killing your squire, while all you can do is watch in horror as spear after spear impales your hopeless machine pleading for its own life. Fromsoftware were juggling too many experimental mechanics at once for them to play nicely with each other, which makes for a hilarious but bewildering experience. I want to emphasize, I'm not saying all of this to put down Frame Gride needlessly. This game still has some cool unique mechanics and isn't awful to play, but its design almost feels antithetical to its nature as a fighting game. It makes it really hard to know on what grounds to judge Frame Gride. Do I judge it as a multiplayer arena battler despite not being able to play the game online anymore? Or should I judge it solely on the merits of its single-player content? I don't think either is the right answer, but I can't exactly know what it's like playing this game against another skilled opponent. So it's time to cover the story content of Frame Gride. In the year 700 of the imperial calendar, the death of the great Emperor Regilio rocks the kingdoms of Rude, creating a vacuum for the power-hungry ruler of Fairvelk, Margrave Zolt, to instigate a rebellion against the neighboring 6 kingdoms, who are utterly demolished by Zolt's regiment of famed knights piloting ancient weapons known as Frame Grides, or Cavaliers. The last hope of the Empire, Archbishop Melange, in his late years, bestows his blessing and Cavalier upon a new nameless successor, so that he may relieve the kingdoms from war and take down the fearsome knights of Zolt. This story context is all drawn from a translated version of the Japanese manual and the brief intro cutscene preceding a new playthrough, but it's not essential information that develops throughout the game, more so just set dressing loosely connecting the 10 main battles. The narrative of Frame Gride is so inconsequential that the game might as well not have one at all. There's not even anything more to discuss during this single-player focused segment, not even a satisfying ending with any significance. The real campaign of Frame Gride is actually the 10 scripted fights against the Dread Knights. I say scripted because these opponents will only show up in their original arenas once. They're unlike the random frames that pop up across previously cleared zones. The Dread Knights always have the same equipment, elements, and squires every single fight and rematch against them. These matches spike in difficulty randomly, with the fast frame opponents usually being way harder than the other knights, but there is a general difficulty slope across these battles. The brevity of the campaign raises its own issues. In order to keep up with the increasingly powerful knights, you either need the skill or improved equipment as a counterbalance, neither of which the player is given ample time to acquire, if strictly following the clearly intended path of each subsequent knight always being zoomed in on the map screen. Winning is still possible, but feels much more luck dependent, and will end up more frustrating when losing a tough 7-minute survival match just because your damage output is lacking. It's hard to notice the deficiency of the starting build until fully realizing your own. Only then is the player on an equal footing with the late stage knights and final boss. However, the game doesn't allow a natural progression of power for the player to feel they've grown any stronger. All of that needs to be sought out by the player on their own time, completely isolated from the story, and practically feels like skipping a bunch of steps to get to the top, making the latter half of the main battles feel either like bashing your head into a slot machine or cheating. The randomized frames that you can fight in previously cleared areas are not as diverse as Armored Core Arena opponents, with Frame Gride's far slimmer weapon selection, but they can still be interesting to fight, even if not particularly challenging compared to the main knights. There can be outliers when the parts align and create a swift killing machine, but due to the randomness, most builds turn out mediocre with no defining trait besides any powerful squires in their arsenal. This doesn't combine well with the rather dumb AI that typically doesn't play aggressively aside from light frames. Given the ability to choose a map with walls and corners allows this to be far more exploitable than when fighting the Dread Knights in a new arena each time. So while this feature adds single player replayability, it still doesn't retain interest for long as most of the opponents are uncompelling. This is mostly a means to grind for better equipment. Without these, the solo Frame Gride experience would be incredibly short, only 1 to 2 hours depending on how much you struggle with the main knights. Without grinding, of course. This is sad compared to how great both the single and multiplayer facets of Armored Core Gen 1 was, with the replayability of the first game's campaign and arena modes of Phantasma and MOA nearly doubling the length of their respective games. On top of the already vastly customizable and competitive PvP mode, it's clear there was far less time put into the solo aspect of Frame Gride, which is a real shame since that's what made Armored Core so memorable to me. If anybody thinks it's unfair for me to so heavily compare Frame Gride to Armored Core, consider Frame Gride came out after the end of 1st Gen AC, after Master Arena, the most refined title of the series so far that excels through its single-player content alone. Granted, with both titles releasing 5 months apart, it could be reasonable to assume that Frame Gride was partially in development alongside Master Arena, but still likely that the same team made both titles. My point is that Fromsoftware already made multiple fantastic mech games. They knew what they were doing and demonstrated that even new ideas like arena mode integrated well with the original vision of Armored Core. How is it then that Frame Gride falls short in nearly every aspect that Armored Core succeeded in? It has no compelling narrative, its combat feels unsatisfying, its mechanics don't mesh well with each other, its customization aspect is decent on its own, but still lacks the depth of AC. Of course, I don't want to judge this game poorly because it isn't like Armored Core. I can appreciate that FromSoft wanted to do an entirely new thing and make it different from AC. In those regards, they succeeded because almost all of Frame Gride's mechanics are completely unique to itself, and that's pretty impressive. But in the process of creating a new framework, the developers threw out almost everything that made Armored Core great. Even something as simple as an arena mode, as uninspired as that would be, would greatly enhance the single-player experience of Frame Gride. So I'm not going to negatively weigh the fundamental differences from Armored Core against Frame Gride or its shortcomings compared to its predecessor super heavily. I am still disappointed at its shallowness, and the fact that this was all avoidable given the experience of the developers. I'm not going to say this was all entirely intentional. There is some indication of troubled development, judging by a few early screenshots and the state of the game itself. It's reasonable to assume that FromSoft knew what they were doing with the PlayStation 1. The same can't be said about the new Dreamcast hardware within a shorter time frame. These images show that story mode could have been far more in-depth, with hints of actual levels, one odd spaceship that at least shows there were other enemies drafted for the player to fight besides frames. The old FromSoftware product page for Frame Gride shows screenshots for the final build of the game, as expected, but the modern web page oddly only consists of pre-release material that otherwise would never see the light of day. From these we get two whole unique iterations of the UI, one very bare bones, clearly from the early development stages, with barely detailed mechs or the map itself. The second design is much more fleshed out, with a Kingsfield 4 style health or energy orb, a timer that isn't present in the game besides multiplayer mode, and a weapon window that might indicate a planned ability to switch weapons, instead of each one being mapped to a specific button or context. In these middle development screenshots are the aforementioned spaceship, which itself is in a beta map that could be more akin to an Armored Core stage than a straight arena, alongside another image alluding to free camera control with a front shot of the player's mech, in possibly the same totem map as the flying ship. Finally, there's a nice render of the gazebo stage that made its way into the final game. This was clearly one the designers were set on, as it was the map present in the earliest looking screenshot, perhaps even the first complete level the developers made. This is a very interesting look into the development of Frame Gride that isn't available for other FromSoft games. There are a dozen or so Japanese magazine interviews throughout the years, but rarely anything as direct or telling as development material. What I can glean from this is that a lot was cut from Frame Gride, or it went through many experimental stages. Maybe its mechanics were too similar to Armored Core or weren't compelling enough to keep in, and the final version that ended up releasing was a compromise of the best remnants of Frame Gride, polished with the remaining time and resources the development team had. All this shows is that a large single-player mode could have been present, or the camera controls gave the player more freedom. Ultimately, though, this doesn't change the final product. What could have been isn't. Frame Gride is still rigid and awkward to play, without enough to have kept players engaged for long. As a result, Frame Gride never caught on in the competitive scene as much as its PS1 counterpart did, despite the Dreamcast having the advantage of being able to connect to the internet for online matches. Its online support lasted less than 2 full years, though likely partly resulting from the failure of the Dreamcast and Sega's network service to gain traction over unpopularity of the game itself. Still, I haven't found any evidence of Fromsoftware hosting Frame Gride tournaments as they did with Armored Core, not even a single event celebrating the game's launch or to promote competition. Granted, this doesn't mean for 100% certainty that no tournaments were hosted at all. Documentation in this era, especially for a Japan-only release, is rather lacking, but I'm pretty confident that there weren't many Frame Gride events at the very most. Judging how this game never released outside of Japan, it likely wasn't successful enough to make the jump to Western audiences. Why would Fromsoftware dedicate their resources towards a smaller fanbase, greatly overshadowed by the success of Armored Core? It could also be that Frame Gride tournaments were smaller independent events, or solely hosted online and not given much coverage. I didn't necessarily want this segment to try and prove Frame Gride is a poor competitive fighter through evidence or something like that. I only started looking into potential tournaments out of curiosity. Armored Core from its inception had successful competitions for the greatest ravens to rise above their peers. I wanted to know if Frame Gride, for a brief moment, had the same bustling multiplayer scene. Unfortunately, I have no way of knowing. I'd like to hear about any information that I possibly missed out on, but I'm leaning towards the sad reality of Frame Gride never spawning a competitive scene. I've been pretty hard on Frame Gride for these past few segments, so I want to turn attention to something this game does quite well, that being its music and visual presentation. The arcade-level hardware of the Dreamcast allowed for very clean video output despite its 480p resolution. As a result, the well-detailed textures of the environments and mech models shine through, creating a regal and vibrant aesthetic very distinct from Armored Core. Maps are higher detailed, although this is next-gen hardware, so that's to be expected. The skyboxes don't contribute much to beauty as they did in AC, but that's made up for among the environment itself. Places like the Silent Forest and Fallen Bridge have unique atmospheric effects through the use of fog, while an entire stage lies underwater with a harsh teal overlay. Many of these maps are distinct in their own way, sometimes amplifying the fight's intensity in the case of Ballantine, taking place in a keep of iron and fire, with brutal spikes dangling from the ceiling and the oppressive gurgling of lava partially drowning out the music. This stage is also quite small, and Ballantine quickly spawns 3 squires, making this one of the most chaotic but fun fights in the campaign, as both of you will be blasted to hell by his own squire's attacks. The final boss, Zidlano, takes place in an ominous cathedral, with the only opponent differing from the regular frames, being a large bug-like monster that could easily be composed of organics over steel. The arena is quickly blasted away to an otherworldly space that certainly sells the stakes of the battle. Zidlano is also more of a gimmick fight, as melee is practically impossible with his lower body constantly damaging the nearby player, with his attacks being more telegraphed and dodgeable. The battle music in Frame Gride shifts from the stage track to a more dramatic end theme around either player reaching the 20% health mark, in this instance instigating the most Eternal Ring-esque orchestral stinger. Final boss in Ethereal Plane. Medieval aesthetic, Sagawa, Saito, Hoshino, and Kanda as the composer, and a crafting system with magical gems? Was Frame Gride just Eternal Ring Zero this whole time? Jokes aside, the soundtrack of Frame Gride is very reminiscent of Eternal Ring that would release a year later, sharing a lot of the same instrument samples and obviously the same composers. Both games share the medieval fantasy vibe, and Frame Gride's music almost feels like a beta Eternal Ring OST at times, with some striking similarities in composition and tone. Only Frame Gride lacks a consistent motif and the multi-layered melodies. I wouldn't say the music of Frame Gride is as good as Eternal Ring, as the lack of motifs make the whole soundtrack fragmented like the PS1 Kingsfield trilogy, but there are still some hidden gems amongst the many battle themes. Most peculiar is the jazzy online menu track that's completely different in tone from practically the rest of the game, which is a shame, since it's my favorite one. 9 Ball's rapid piano theme lives on in the underwater arena. While the story prologue music is quite literally the beta Eternal Ring melody from some twisted alternate reality of that game releasing on the Dreamcast. Frame Gride is certainly an interesting Fromsoftware entry that bridges the gap between their first and second generation of games, with the beauty of Eternal Ring and the clunkiness of their earlier titles. Well, it's not like the jank ever went away with Fromsoftware, but the design of Frame Gride is very front-loaded with mechanics without much time or effort put in to flesh things out, giving it a tech demo feel. Ironically, Frame Gride's actual demo, pilot style, feels much snappier and better to play in some regards, with no energy meter, quicker attack/movements, and far better tracking for both the camera and bullet projectiles. Pilot style is very difficult as a result, so perhaps FromSoft did some tweaking to make this game more balanced, but ended up making Frame Gride feel stiff and less engaging. This prototypal and small-scale design is a framework FromSoft eases out of in the PlayStation 2 era. Frame Gride is an example of their early development style that feels out of place on a next-gen system. Still, Frame Gride is bolstered by a pleasant aesthetic and the soul of the Dreamcast itself. Despite not having something as cool as a VMU minigame as Master of Arena had for the Pocket Station, playing Frame Gride on the weird Dreamcast controller and original hardware made the experience so much more authentic. It's not a feeling as apparent on the PlayStation 1 or 2. The vibe of the Dreamcast almost seeps into its games, through each title having a cute, unique FMV sprite and animations always present while playing, or the funky internet browser built into certain games that in the case of Frame Gride would have directed you towards FromSoftware's webpage, and more, all with an accompanying Frame Gride style background theme complete with a silly little guy moving across the screen. There's a magic to this system that transcends the software itself. So many charming little design quirks waiting to be discovered, so much potential sadly squandered by the swift death of the Dreamcast. It may seem off topic, but sometimes the hardware is just as important as the Fromsoftware. Playing Frame Gride on emulator almost removes it from the context of the awkward Dreamcast controller, the VMU, and the aesthetic of the console that itself adds to the game. Frame Gride on its own is nothing special. Frame Gride on the Dreamcast is an entirely unique experience. Unlike most titles up until now, Frame Gride is a pretty inconsequential FromSoft entry. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless you really dig the aesthetic or mechanics, and are desperate for more FromSoft mecha. If you already have a Dreamcast, however, Frame Gride is a great addition to your library. On emulation, however, the game is not as charming, so it's not something I can recommend as easily as King's Field or Armored Core. I wouldn't say to buy an entire Dreamcast just to play this game either. I'm stupid and can justify the decision, but if you're really itching to play Frame Gride, emulation isn't a bastardization of the game. You might even be able to play online easier. Just don't expect to be blown away, except for by your squire. Thank you for watching. I hope Frame Gride fans will be at peace with this one. I don't hate the game and tried to be as fair as possible, but I didn't have all that much good things to say, even though I like to be generally positive in these reviews. And I don't want anyone to get the impression that I absolutely despise Frame Gride from the critiques. Anyways, let me know what you thought in the comments, and also any interesting Dreamcast games you want me to try out. I've gotten a lot more out of this system than I expected when buying it just for Frame Gride, and it's quickly become one of my favorite consoles. I already have an idea for a spin-off video with one Dreamcast exclusive, maybe two, and I'd like to know any other cool games this system holds.